Let's jump right in. Today, we're diving into this explainer to unpack something you've probably seen all over the news: the staggering rise in autism diagnoses. We're going to cut right through the noise, separate the actual science from the sensationalized myths, and figure out what is really going on.
Here is our roadmap. We'll be hitting the epidemic illusion, the evolution of diagnosis, the role of genetics, environmental factors, debunking some persistent myths, and finally, understanding human diversity. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The epidemic illusion. Unpacking the staggering numbers.
So here's the reality right now. Today, about 1 in 31 kids in the U.S. are diagnosed on the autism spectrum. That rate has absolutely skyrocketed over the last few decades. And honestly, we're seeing similar steady rises across most high-income countries all over the world. This massive spike leads us to a million-dollar question, doesn't it? Did something suddenly change in our biology, or is this so-called epidemic just an illusion? Well, to figure that out, we first need to make sure we know exactly what it is we're measuring.
You see, autism spectrum disorder isn't just a single illness, and it's definitely not a linear scale going from less autistic to more autistic. Instead, experts now view it as this incredibly complex wheel. Every autistic individual has a totally unique mix of traits, things like sensory processing, emotional regulation, and motor skills. This fundamental shift in how we understand autism, that's our first major clue to those rising numbers.
Section 2. The evolution of diagnosis. How changing definitions drove the numbers.
Think about it like this. Before the word even existed and the diagnostic criteria expanded, we literally didn't have the tools to identify these individuals. Historically, autism was lumped in with conditions like childhood schizophrenia. It actually wasn't until 1980 that it was officially included as its own distinct diagnosis in the DSM, the Standard Medical Reference Book. And then in 2013, the DSM-5 combined multiple diagnoses, including Asperger's, into the autism spectrum disorder we know today. So the surge in cases? It heavily correlates with our evolving understanding and broadened criteria.
A really crucial point here is that social resources play a massive, massive role. Take Austin and Laredo, for example. They're only about 235 miles apart in Texas, right? But Austin's autism diagnosis rates for children are nearly double. Why? Well, Austin has a much higher per capita income, access to pediatricians, diagnostic services, early screening. That is what drives these geographical discrepancies, not some underlying difference in biology.
We also see that boys are diagnosed about 3 times as often as girls. But scientists are realizing this is highly likely because girls are just better at masking their behavioral differences. Basically, they've been historically overlooked. So as we get better at diagnosing girls, the overall numbers naturally go up. The big takeaway here? Historical biases and access to healthcare have artificially skewed the numbers for a long time.
Section 3. The role of genetics. Unlocking our DNA.
Even with those diagnostic changes, there is still a small, real increase in cases, which brings us to a really powerful biological reality. Research starting way back in the 1970s revealed that if one identical twin has autism, the other sometimes has a greater than 90% chance of having it too. But for fraternal twins who don't share identical DNA, that drops to just 1 in 3. This absolutely proves the call is coming from inside the genetic house.
Check out this breakdown. Of that roughly 80% genetic foundation, about half comes from inherited variants passed down from parents. But notice that 20% slice labeled de novo mutations. These are spontaneous, brand new mutations that accumulate in sperm or eggs. We are all born with these totally random mutations, and if one just happens to land in a gene critical for fetal brain development, well, that perfectly explains why autism can suddenly appear in a child, even if they have zero family history of it.
Section 4. Environmental factors and risks. Navigating the non-genetic influences.
Now, I want to be very, very clear here. Exploring these non-genetic factors is absolutely not about casting blame on parents for what they did or didn't do during pregnancy. It's just about understanding incredibly complex interactions. While we can't give you an exact risk percentage like checking a weather app, robust studies have actually linked these specific environmental factors to an increased likelihood of a child developing autism. Things like living close to fields treated with industrial pesticides, exposure to toxic heavy metals, or preterm birth, they all show measurable associations. But, and this is a huge but, this builds into one of the biggest challenges in all of science: directionality. It's incredibly hard for researchers to prove causation. For instance, older parents are more likely to have an autistic child, right? But that's often due to those accumulated sperm mutations we just talked about.
The environment, like career goals that lead people to delay having kids, dictates the parental age, but the underlying mechanism is still genetic. It just goes to show how deeply intertwined environment and biology truly are.
Section 5. Debunking autism myths. Filtering out the noise.
Okay, let's clear up some major misconceptions. Early studies caused a lot of panic by linking things like Tylenol or SSRI antidepressants during pregnancy to autism. But here's the catch. When scientists actually do large, sibling-controlled studies that account for all those complex genetic and environmental variables within the exact same family, the link between Tylenol and autism completely vanishes. It turns out the untreated fevers that prompt a mother to take Tylenol in the first place pose a far greater risk to fetal brain development. Same with SSRIs. The underlying maternal genetics that prompt the use of the medication are the true link, not the drug itself.
And this brings us to the most persistent myth out there, which the SCN1A story really helps explain. It shows, with a lot of empathy, exactly why parents might mistakenly blame a vaccine. Here's what happens. A child gets a routine vaccine. Their immune system triggers a normal fever. But because they have a pre-existing mutation in the SCN1A gene, that fever triggers a seizure. Then later comes an autism diagnosis. The true biological trigger was always that pre-existing genetic mutation reacting to a totally normal fever. But the parents just see the vaccine and the sudden change in their child.
Despite being widely, aggressively debunked since Andrew Wakefield's fraudulent paper back in 1998, which, by the way, literally cost him his medical license, the vaccine myth somehow persists. But as one vaccine scientist and parent of an autistic child noted in our source material, there is absolutely zero plausible mechanism for a childhood vaccine to alter complex in utero fetal brain development, period. It is as settled as anything can possibly be in science.
Section 6. Understanding human diversity. Rethinking neurodivergence.
We often hear autism talked about like it's a singular, terrible entity, almost like cancer. But this comparison is so crucial to grasp. Unlike cancer, which is a disease we actively want to eradicate, autism is not an illness. It's a fundamental form of human diversity. It's this diverse, rich family of complex conditions shaped by our genetics and our environment. That means the ultimate goal of all this scientific research is uncovering mechanisms for better understanding and support, not casting blame, and certainly not finding a cure.
I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. Now that we understand the incredibly deep, complex scientific roots of autism, and we know that this surge is heavily driven by evolving diagnostics and our own genetic code, how do we use this knowledge? Instead of fighting human diversity, how can society shift its focus to building a healthier, more fulfilling, and highly supportive world for autistic individuals? Think about that, and keep seeking the science behind the headlines.